This 1892 orphanage portrait looks respectable until you see the suitcases. The matron stands straight, her dark dress crisp and proper. The children sit in a perfect row on the stone steps, hair combed, faces solemn. It could be any institutional photograph from the era, the kind you find in historical society files under charitable works. But Dr. Ellen Marsh could not stop looking at those suitcases. Each child held one, perched carefully on their lap. Small leather cases, the kind you might pack for a weekend visit. Except these children were not going on visits. Ellen had been the lead archivist at the Western Pennsylvania Historical Center for 11 years. She had cataloged thousands of images from Pittsburgh's industrial past, factory scenes, society portraits, street views of neighborhoods long demolished. She knew how to read a photograph, how to notice what the camera operator wanted you to see and what they accidentally captured. This one arrived in a banker's box donated by the estate of a woman named Constance Aldrich, whose grandfather had served on multiple charitable boards in the 1890s. The box contained ledgers, correspondence, and a thin folder of photographs labeled simply St. Catherine's Home for Friendless Children. The photograph was 8 by 10 inches, mounted on thick cardboard backing, professional studio quality. Ellen tilted it under her desk lamp. The matron's hand rested on the shoulder of the child at the end of the row. There were 9 children total, ages maybe 6 to 13, 7 girls, 2 boys. Their clothing was uniform but well-maintained. Dark wool dresses for the girls, knickers and jackets for the boys. No one smiled. That was normal for the era. Exposure times demanded stillness, but Ellen kept returning to the suitcases. She pulled her magnifying glass from the drawer and leaned close. The leather showed careful stitching, brass clasps, identical cases, institutional purchase. Then she saw it. On the case held by the third child from the left, a small paper label was tied to the handle. She adjusted the angle of the lamp. The label had text. She moved to the next child, another label, and the next. Every suitcase had one. Ellen felt her pulse quicken. She opened the imaging software on her computer and placed the photograph on her flatbed scanner. High resolution, 1200 dpi. The scan took 3 minutes. She pulled the file up and zoomed in on the first visible label. The handwriting was neat, clerical. She could make out most of it. Coleridge Mining Company, Fayette County. She moved to another label. Allegheny Textile Mill No. 3. Another, Cambria Iron Works, Johnstown. This was not just a photograph. It was a shipping manifest. Ellen Marsh had spent her career making invisible histories visible. She came to archival work through a degree in social history, writing her master's thesis on women's labor in Pittsburgh's garment district. She learned early that institutional records often told 2 stories. The official version that went into annual reports and newspaper notices, and the version buried in accounting ledgers, staff memos, private correspondence, things people wrote when they were not performing for public consumption. She had seen photographs of model tenements that turned out to be slum clearance schemes, images of industrial education programs that trained children for 12-hour shifts instead of schooling. But this felt different, more deliberate. The suitcases were props, carefully chosen for the photograph. The labels were not hidden. They were just small enough that a casual viewer would miss them. She turned the photograph over. On the back, in faded ink, St. Catherine's Placement Initiative, September 1892. Photographer, Howell & Sons, Liberty Avenue. Below that, in different handwriting. First group, 20 more next month if all goes well. Ellen set the photograph down and opened her notebook, St. Catherine's Home for Friendless Children. She had seen the name before, but only in passing references. She pulled up the Historical Center's digital database and ran a search. 3 hits. One was a brief mention in a Presbyterian church directory from 1889. Another was a property record showing the orphanage building at 412 Wiley Avenue, purchased in 1885 and sold in 1897. The third was a newspaper clipping from the Pittsburgh Post, April 1893. Charitable placement program expands. St. Catherine's Home places 200 children in honest labor. She read the article twice. The language was glowing. The orphanage was praised for finding productive situations for children who might otherwise become burdens on public charity. The matron, Mrs. Adelaide Thorne, was quoted saying their program offered children the dignity of work and the moral instruction of discipline. Companies were lauded for their Christian generosity in taking in these young charges. Not one word about wages, working conditions, or what kind of labor these children would perform. Ellen picked up her phone and called Richard Bannister. He was a historian at Carnegie Mellon who specialized in Gilded Age labor systems. She had worked with him before on a project documenting immigrant workers in the steel mills. He answered on the third ring. "Richard, do you know anything about orphan placement programs in Pittsburgh in the 1890s? "Sure," he said. "They were common. Why?" "I have a photograph. Children with suitcases, labels on the cases addressed to mining companies and factories." There was a pause. "Send me the image." She emailed the scan and waited. She heard him open it on his end. "Jesus," he said quietly. "Do you have any records from the orphanage itself?" "Not yet, just this photo and some mentions in directories and newspapers." "You need to find the placement contracts," Richard said. These programs operated under indenture law, technically legal at the time. The orphanage would sign a contract with a company. The company got a worker. The orphanage got a placement fee. The child got room and board in exchange for labor until they turned 18 or 21. But the contracts varied wildly. Some were exploitative in name only. Others were barely disguised slavery. How do I tell the difference? Look for wages, working hours, education provisions, and termination clauses. If there are none, or if the language is deliberately vague, that tells you something. Ellen hung up and pulled the banker's box back onto her desk. She went through every folder. Most of it was financial correspondence related to the Aldrich family's coal investments. Then, near the bottom, she found a leather portfolio tied with string. Inside were 7 documents, each one a placement contract from St. Catherine's Home for Friendless Children. The dates ranged from September 1892 to November 1894. She spread them across her desk and began to read. The contracts were printed forms with blanks filled in by hand. Each one followed the same structure. The orphanage agreed to provide 1 healthy child of good moral character suitable for light industrial work. The company agreed to provide room, board, and Christian supervision. The term of placement was until the child reaches majority or until the contract is otherwise dissolved by mutual agreement. There was no mention of wages, no mention of schooling, no mention of working hours. The termination clause said only that the company could return a child to the orphanage if the child proves unsuitable due to illness, moral deficiency, or refusal to work. Ellen noticed something else. At the bottom of each contract, in small print, placement fee, $40 per child payable upon delivery. She did the math. If St. Catherine's placed 200 children in 1893 alone, that was $8,000, equivalent to over $250,000 today. And according to the contracts, the orphanage had no ongoing obligations once placement occurred. The children were simply transferred from one institution to another, permanently. Ellen spent the next 2 days in the Pennsylvania State Archives in Harrisburg. She found St. Catherine's incorporation papers, filed in 1885 by a consortium of Presbyterian businessmen. The stated mission was to rescue friendless children from vice and poverty and prepare them for useful Christian lives. The board of directors included 3 factory owners, 2 mine operators, and a railroad executive. She found annual reports from 1887 to 1895. Each one emphasized the number of children successfully placed in working homes. The language never used the word labor. It was always homes or Christian households or honest situations. But the numbers told a different story. In 1892, St. Catherine's housed an average of 40 children at any given time. That same year, they placed 167 children. The math did not work unless they were constantly taking in new children specifically to place them out. Ellen found intake records that confirmed it. Children arrived from other failing orphanages, from almshouses, from parents too poor to feed them. They stayed at St. Catherine's an average of 6 weeks, just long enough to assess their health and work capacity. Then they were photographed, packed, and shipped. She found the intake form for one of the children in the photograph. A girl named Margaret Hurley, age 10, admitted in August 1892. The form noted she was small but sturdy, capable of mill work. Next to her name, someone had written Allegheny Textile, September 12. Ellen drove to Allegheny City, now Pittsburgh's north side. The textile mill was long gone, replaced by a parking garage and a discount furniture store. but the local historical society had records. She sat in their reading room with a box of mill employment logs from the 1890s. She found Margaret Hurley listed on a payroll sheet from September 1892. Her job title was Doffer. Ellen knew what that meant. Doffers were children who worked the spinning room, replacing full bobbins with empty ones while the machines ran. It required small hands and fast reflexes. It was dangerous work. The machines did not stop. The payroll sheet showed Margaret earned 60 cents a week, but the notation next to her name said, "Wage held in trust per contract." The money went to the mill, not to the child. Ellen looked through more records. She found 5 other children from St. Catherine's at the same mill, all placed in September and October of 1892. One was discharged in January 1893, cause listed as injury to hand. Another disappeared from the records in March, no explanation given. She needed to see the places these children were sent. Ellen drove south to Fayette County, to the town of Coleridge. The mining company was defunct, the entrance to the old shaft sealed with concrete and a historical marker. She walked the ridge where the company housing once stood. Foundations were still visible through the undergrowth. She met with a local historian, a retired teacher named Harold Voss, who had spent years documenting the lives of mining families. Company towns were self-contained, Harold said, unfolding a map across his kitchen table. The company owned the houses, the store, even the church. Workers paid rent and bought goods on credit. Most of them ended up in debt, couldn't leave because they owed more than they earned. What about children? Breaker boys mostly, sorting coal, 10, 12 hours a day. Dangerous as hell. Rock falls, coal dust, machinery. Every family lost someone. Did the company bring in orphans? Harold looked at her. I've seen mentions. Records from 1893 talk about placing boys from charitable institutions. The company liked it. Orphans had no family to complain if something went wrong. Ellen showed him the photograph. He studied it quietly. That one, he said, pointing to the youngest boy in the picture. He looked 7, maybe 8, too young even for breaker work by most standards, and standards were low. Ellen found the boy's intake record that evening. His name was Thomas Brennan, age 7, placed with Coleridge Mining in September 1892. She searched for death records. It took an hour, but she found it. Thomas Brennan, age 8, died February 1894. Cause of death, crushed by coal cart. She sat in her car outside the county courthouse and cried. By the time Ellen returned to Pittsburgh, she had documented 11 deaths among children placed by St. Catherine's between 1892 and 1896, mining accidents, factory injuries, illness attributed to overwork and poor ventilation. She had found 24 more children who simply vanished from company records with no explanation. Some might have run away, others might have been sent back to the orphanage and replaced elsewhere. But the contracts made it clear that unsuitable children could be returned, and the orphanage would provide a replacement at no additional charge, a warranty system for human beings. She compiled everything into a report and requested a meeting with the Historical Center's Collections Committee. The committee included the center's director, the head curator, 2 board members, and a representative from the Aldrich Family Foundation, which provided significant annual funding. The foundation representative was Constance Aldrich's great-nephew, a corporate attorney named Brian Aldrich. He had donated the banker's box that started Ellen's investigation. The meeting was held in the center's conference room on a Wednesday afternoon. Ellen distributed copies of her findings, the photograph projected on the screen behind her. She walked them through it step by step. The photograph as a staged shipping manifest, the placement contracts as legalized child trafficking, the financial motive for the orphanage and the companies, the deaths and disappearances. The director, a man named Thomas Keating, leaned back in his chair. This is compelling research, Ellen, but what exactly are you proposing we do with it? I want to build an exhibition, she said, around this photograph. Tell the real story of what placement programs were. Give names to the children in this image. Show how charitable language was used to disguise exploitation. Brian Aldrich cleared his throat. I appreciate Dr. Marsh's thoroughness, but I have concerns. My family has a long history of philanthropy in this city. My great-great-grandfather served on the board of St. Catherine's because he believed in helping orphaned children. To suggest he was part of a criminal enterprise is frankly insulting and historically irresponsible. I'm not suggesting anyone saw themselves as criminals, Ellen said carefully. I'm saying the system was designed to provide cheap labor to industrial companies. Whether people acknowledged that openly or wrapped it in the language of Christian charity, the result was the same. Children worked in deadly conditions for no wages. One of the board members, a retired professor named Linda Grayson, spoke up. Ellen, how certain are you about the interpretation of those labels? Could they have been added later? Could the photograph have been staged for a different purpose? The labels match the handwriting in the orphanage's own placement records, Ellen said. And the photographer's notation on the back references more children coming the next month. This was not symbolic. It was documentation of an ongoing operation. But the language of the time was different, Brian Aldrich said. People believed work was morally instructive, especially for the poor. You're applying modern standards to historical practices. People also believed slavery was morally instructive, Ellen said. That does not mean we should display photographs of enslaved people picking cotton without context or critique. This photograph was used to show the respectability of the orphanage and the generosity of the companies. It hides everything that came after. Our job as historians is to reveal that. The room fell silent. Director Keating folded his hands on the table. Let me be frank. The Aldrich Foundation provides 18% of our operating budget. I'm not saying that should dictate our scholarship, but we need to be thoughtful about how we frame controversial material. Perhaps a smaller exhibit in the research library rather than the main gallery. Ellen felt anger rise in her chest. These children died, they were sold, and we have the documentation to prove it. If we bury this because it makes donors uncomfortable, what is the point of this institution? Linda Grayson nodded slowly. I agree with Dr. Marsh. This is exactly the kind of history we should be surfacing. The whole point of archival work is to correct sanitized narratives. The committee debated for another 30 minutes. Finally, Keating proposed a compromise. Ellen could mount a small exhibition in the research library gallery with accompanying educational materials. But the photograph could not be displayed without additional context from other historians confirming her interpretation, and the exhibition title and wall text would need approval from the board. It was not what Ellen wanted, but it was a start. She said yes. She spent the next 4 months building the exhibition. She tracked down descendants of the children in the photograph. 3 families responded. One was Margaret Hurley's great-great-niece, a woman named Claire Hurley who lived in Ohio. Claire drove to Pittsburgh to meet with Ellen. I knew my great-great-grandmother had been in an orphanage, Claire said, sitting in Ellen's office. But family stories said she was adopted by a kind mill owner who gave her a good life. That was the version passed down. Ellen showed her the records, the mill employment logs, the contract that held Margaret's wages, the notation about the hand injury. Claire read in silence for a long time. So she was not adopted. She was purchased. Legally, yes, Ellen said. The orphanage called it placement, but the contract treated her as property with a cash value. Did she survive? Ellen had traced Margaret through later records. She appeared in a census in 1900, working as a seamstress and boarding in a house with 6 other women. She married in 1903. She died in 1954. She survived, Ellen said, but she worked in that mill from age 10 to 16 with no wages, no schooling, and no choice. Claire looked at the photograph. Her eyes stopped on the small figure holding the suitcase with the Allegheny textile label. That is her. Ellen included Claire's family story in the exhibition. She also found a descendant of Thomas Brennan, the boy who died at Coleridge Mining. His name was Michael Brennan, a retired steelworker who still lived in Pittsburgh. He gave Ellen a short statement that she mounted on the wall next to Thomas's intake record and death certificate. My great-uncle was 7 years old. They worked him to death and called it charity. His name was Thomas Brennan, and he mattered. The exhibition opened in October. It was small. Just 1 gallery room, but Ellen designed it carefully. The 1892 photograph was the centerpiece, printed large with labeled magnifications, showing each child's suitcase tag and destination. Around it, she displayed the contracts, the intake records, the death certificates, the newspaper articles praising the program. She included economic data showing the profitability of child labor. She added photographs of breaker boys in mines and children in textile mills from other contemporary sources, demonstrating that the work St. Catherine's children performed was identical to the most exploitative child labor of the era. The wall text was direct. Between 1887 and 1896, St. Catherine's Home for Friendless Children placed over 8 children with industrial companies in Pennsylvania. These placements were legally sanctioned contracts that provided children as laborers in exchange for fees paid to the orphanage. The children received no wages, no education, and no means of leaving. Many were injured or killed. This photograph, taken in September 1892, documents 9 children about to be sent to mines, mills, and factories. They are holding suitcases labeled with their destinations. This was not adoption. It was not charity. It was child trafficking under the cover of moral reform. The exhibition received local press coverage. 2 articles called it revisionist history. 3 praised it as necessary correction of the historical record. Ellen gave a public lecture that drew 60 people. Half of them were supportive. The other half accused her of attacking Pittsburgh's philanthropic legacy. Brian Aldrich did not attend the opening, but he sent a letter to the Historical Center's board, formally objecting to the exhibition and requesting that his family's continued support be reconsidered in light of the institution's apparent disregard for nuance and balance in historical interpretation. Director Keating called Ellen into his office the week after the exhibition opened. He told her the board had decided the exhibition would close after 3 months instead of the planned 6. He didn't say it was because of the Aldrich Foundation, but Ellen understood. 3 months is enough, she said, but it turned out she was wrong. 2 weeks before the exhibition was scheduled to close, Ellen received an email from a graduate student at the University of Pittsburgh. The student was researching labor history and had visited the exhibition. She wanted Ellen to know that she had found similar photographs in other archives, orphan homes in Philadelphia, Baltimore, and Cleveland, all from the 1890s, all showing children with suitcases, all with labels visible under magnification. Ellen requested copies. The photographs arrived digitally. She spread them across her computer screen. The composition was nearly identical. Institutional settings, proud matrons, children in rows, small luggage, shipping labels. One photograph from a Baltimore orphanage showed labels addressed to canneries on the Chesapeake Bay. Another from Cleveland showed labels addressed to furniture factories and tanneries. This was not one orphanage's isolated practice. It was a regional system, possibly national. Ellen compiled the images into a folder and sent them to Richard Bannister. He called her that evening. "I've been looking through state legislative records from the 1890s, he said. There was a reform movement starting around 1895 that tried to regulate child labor. It mostly failed, but some states passed laws requiring wages for indentured children and limiting the age for factory work. The language in the debates is telling. Reformers talked about the orphan trade. They knew what was happening, but industrial lobbies killed most of the bills. So this was a known system. Yes, and profitable. I found testimony from an orphanage director in New York who admitted his institution collected $30,000 a year from placement fees. That is nearly $1 million in today's money. The system worked because everyone involved could claim moral high ground. The orphanages said they were saving children from poverty. The companies said they were providing opportunity. The state said it was cheaper than public relief, and the children had no voice to say otherwise. Ellen added this information to the exhibition in the final 2 weeks. She printed the photographs from other cities and mounted them alongside the Pittsburgh image. She wrote a new label. This photograph is not unique. Between 1880 and 1900, hundreds of orphanages in industrial cities participated in placement programs that supplied children to factories, mines, and mills. These programs were defended as charity and reform. They were, in practice, a labor trafficking network built into the philanthropic infrastructure of the Gilded Age. On the last day of the exhibition, Ellen stood in the gallery and watched visitors. An older woman stopped in front of the photograph for a long time. She leaned close to read the labels on the suitcases. Then she turned to Ellen. "My grandfather was in an orphanage in Erie in the 1900s, the woman said. He was sent to work in a glass factory when he was 9. He never talked about it. I always wondered why." Ellen handed her a printed resource list, organizations that helped people research family histories tied to orphanages and child labor. The exhibition closed the next day. Ellen packed the materials carefully and returned them to the archives. The photograph went back into its folder, back into the banker's box. But it was cataloged now, fully described, with a digital file available to researchers. It would not be buried again. Ellen thought often about those suitcases. The care taken to stage the photograph, the labels tied neatly to the handles. Someone decided these children should be documented this way. Perhaps the photographer thought it demonstrated efficiency. Perhaps the matron thought it showed the orphanage's success. Perhaps the companies wanted proof of delivery. But the children themselves left no record of what they thought as they sat on those steps holding their small cases. The camera pointed at them. The shutter clicked. And then they were gone, separated and scattered to places that needed small hands and did not ask questions. Images like this one exist in thousands of archives: orphanage photographs, industrial photographs, family portraits with servants in the background. They sit in drawers and on walls and in online databases. They are labeled with benign descriptions: charitable institution, industrial education, domestic service. But those labels are not neutral. They were chosen by people with power describing people without it. And tiny details, the ones you miss at first glance, often tell a completely different story. The suitcase labels in the 1892 St. Catherine's photograph are a compression of an entire system. A system that treated children as inventory. That measured their worth in dollars and their utility in labor hours. That called exploitation opportunity and trafficking placement and violence moral instruction. The children in that photograph are not names in a tragedy. They are evidence of a crime that was legal, profitable, and praised, and the photograph is still evidence when we look closely, when we refuse to accept the surface story, when we remember that every old image was made by someone who chose what to show and what to hide. The photograph may have been intended to demonstrate respectability, but once you see those labels, you cannot unsee them. And once you understand what they mean, you cannot pretend the children were just going on a trip. They were being shipped, and the camera recorded it. And now, more than a century later, we can finally say what it was.